1988, 27-year-old Scott Johnson was in love, living in Australia, and had just completed his PhD. According to friends and family, he was in the prime of his life, which made his death all the more devastating. Now, 26 years later, authorities have reopened the investigation into Scott's death thanks to his brother Steve Johnson, who used a fortune he made in the early days of the internet to launch his own investigation. That story is the subject of a documentary called On the Precipice.
The next thing we know is that a couple spear fishermen and one of the spear fishermen's sons find a body at the bottom of the cliff. They call the police come. They investigate, they see the body, they see Scott's clothes folded neatly at the top of the cliff. Scott is completely naked.
I got a message that Scott's body had been found at the bottom of the cliff. By the time I got here, about 36 hours later, the police had decided that it was a suicide.
Steve Johnson never believed his brother took his own life, and it took him 24 years to convince authorities to take a second look. And Steve Johnson is here. Thanks for joining us, Steve. I watched this whole piece, half-hour documentary, which is running on the World Channel about 18 times this month. Why were you so convinced from the beginning that your brother did not commit suicide? I should say, just for context, he was gay. He had gone to Australia to be with somebody that he fell in love with. He had just completed his PhD. Why were you so convinced?
Well, Scott and I were very close. We grew up in a very poor family in the 60s, raised with my sister by a single mom. We were lucky enough to make it to college. He graduated from Caltech at the top of his class and then studied at Cambridge University and had moved to Australia to be with a man that he fell in love with at Cambridge. And so he had the brightest academic future. The timing of his death, he had just talked to his professor the morning of the day he died, who said that he had completed the work that he needed for his math PhD. So it just didn't make any sense to me.
And he was looking forward to the birth of your first child, as I understand.
My first child had just been born. He was looking forward to meeting his new niece, who's now 25.
So the circumstances, you hired Daniel Glick, this investigative reporter who had done work on the JonBenét Ramsey case, among others, and he went over there, and he said he was completely open. He wasn't going to do this to please you. I know, if he found out it was a suicide, he was going to say it was a suicide. If he found otherwise, and he tells this story that unfolds in the documentary, basically going from being 50-50 to saying he went like this to believing 80% he thinks it was probably a murder, a homicide.
Well, one of the bombshells that dropped on our family was 17 years after Scott died. There was an inquest in Sydney looking into the deaths of 3 other gay men at the bottom of cliffs around the same time Scott died, and the coroner concluded, in contrast to what the police had said about those young men, that they had committed suicide. The coroner found that they were probably murdered by roving gangs of youths that went to these gay meeting places to rob and sometimes kill the men who were there. And the circumstances just fit Scott's case.
There were some bizarre things, though, about why he took his clothes off, why they were piled so neatly. Did somebody come across him, find him there sunbathing? Did they force him to take his clothes off? I mean, these are things you don't know.
Well, the key thing that came out of the inquest in 2005, downtown Sydney, was that these were the assaults and the killings were happening in gay meeting areas where men would take their clothes off, and they would go to these places, secluded public places, to meet other men. And so the key question in Scott's case was this a gay meeting place? The police had said in 1988 that it was not, that there was no violence there. My private investigator found immediately by traveling there that this was not only then but still now a popular gay meeting place, and that there were hundreds of assaults that he found in court documents around that time.
Now, his then lover did speak to police at the time and said that Scott had talked about suicide. He didn't participate in the documentary, which made me curious, frankly, but he said that your brother had talked about suicide, jumping off, I think, the Golden Gate Bridge.
The police never looked into that story. One of the things that happened when Scott died was, this was in 1988, when it was very dangerous to be out of the closet. And so a lot of Scott's friends didn't want to talk to the police and didn't want an investigation. And whether or not that story was true, the timing of the story, as his boyfriend told it, placed it on the same week that Scott was the best man in my wedding, hundreds of miles away from the Golden Gate Bridge. So it's doubtful that story was true.
What's the status of the investigation now?
So after 2005, I spent another 7 years with the private investigator getting the case reopened. This documentary Australian story aired last February, and finally, the day after it aired, the police joined me in a press conference to announce that they were finally investigating Scott's case. Along the way, during that time, we discovered that there were dozens of other gay men who were killed, and only some of those cases were ever solved. So today, the police are giving us very little information about the investigation that they're conducting into Scott's case. We think that only a much broader investigation into all of these cases can connect the dots and stand a good chance of solving some of them, including Scott's.
Well, congratulations to you for getting as far as you have with it.
Thank you very much.
It's a very touching story.
Thanks for having me.
Steve Johnson. You are probably